Hey guys, Ex-Peon here, and today I'm going to discuss the problem with wisdom in Dungeons and Dragons and why it is always made for a poor core ability score. First, what is wisdom and why does it matter how wise a player character or non-player character is? Well, the Cambridge Dictionary defines wisdom as the ability to use your knowledge and experience to make good decisions and judgments. We immediately come into a problem with this definition, and that is that all of those factors are already represented in a D&D character's profile. Knowledge is covered by intelligence, experience is represented by level, and decision making and judgment ultimately come down to the player or dungeon master piloting that character. So far, wisdom does not sound like a useful ability score for defining a D&D character. Let's see how the designers of the game have described it over the past decades to see if maybe they've understood wisdom in a different way. I combed through every single player's handbook or PHB equivalent released for Dungeons and Dragons and compiled every single word they use to describe wisdom, and here's what I found. Using a word cloud, we can see that the most commonly used terms for wisdom are common sense and intuition, tied for first place, willpower and awareness, tied for second place, and enlightenment, perception, and judgment, tied for third place. So, Dungeons and Dragons has mostly defined wisdom in a similar way as the dictionary does, though they've added unrelated concepts like willpower, awareness, and perception. So, just based on how the dictionary and the creators of Dungeons and Dragons define wisdom, does it deserve to be an ability score? I would say no. Common sense and intuition really just refer to making sound decisions and understanding what's going on around you, and that ultimately comes down to player skill, not character skill. I can't imagine anything less immersive than a DM acting out a player character with great effort and detail, only for a player to ignore all that and just try to roll to understand what's going on and what they should do. Cough, cough, insight, the worst 5e skill there is. Even if wisdom on its own doesn't make sense as an ability score, maybe it works well enough mechanically to look past that, right? Let's investigate. In the original version of the game, wisdom had no real description and only had two mechanical effects. First, it helped determine how quickly a character leveled up, primarily clerics, and second, it might prompt the DM to not allow you to do something unwise. Naturally, that's quite minimal. The following basic and advanced versions of Dungeons and Dragons didn't really expand wisdom too greatly. Wisdom came to encompass spell resistance, and the ways in which classes like clerics benefited from a good wisdom score were expanded, but it still retained the core problem of not having a real role in the game outside of the class system. It's quite common in old school D&D or OSR games to resolve a situation by rolling a d20 under an ability score, but wisdom is the only ability score with no real obvious applications. I might roll under my strength to leap across a chasm, or roll under my dexterity to walk a tightrope, or roll under my intelligence to see if I know whether a certain mushroom is edible or not. But when would I roll under my wisdom to do something? I once asked an OSR Facebook group this question, and none of these decades-long D&D veterans could give me an example. Literally, the only situation I can think of is doing something related to animals, whether that's calming a spooked horse or backing away from a bear without getting mauled. However, charisma for animals is hardly a common enough usage to justify its inclusion. D&D 3rd edition and onward solved this problem by adding a comprehensive skill system and mapping skills to every single ability score, including wisdom. D&D 3rd edition and onward solved this problem by adding a comprehensive skill system and mapping skills to every single ability score, expanding wisdom from just mechanically covering willpower and spiritual classes like clerics and druids to also encompass common tasks like understanding people's intentions, administering first aid, surviving in the wilderness, handling animals, detecting unknown parties or situations, and literally just doing your job with the profession skill of 3rd edition. 5e made this worse by adding optional rules that made NPC morale and player sanity governed by wisdom as well, even though you'd think wiser characters would flee more often than foolish characters. While all of this did make wisdom a much more active and relevant ability score, it also stretched its meaning well beyond what it could sustain, and also invited in inherent contradictions. An old cleric with 20 wisdom, who has spent his entire life cloistered in a monastery, has better survival skills and hearing than a young barbarian who was raised in a nomadic tribe. A druid with 20 wisdom who was raised as a feral child by wolves has a superior ability to read people than a high charisma merchant, even though that druid should be severely socially stunted by her upbringing. Or you get into the more common situation where the rogue, who depends upon their perception to detect enemies and traps, can be outclassed by a cleric who has no training in these situations but just happens to be exceptionally wise. So, what's the solution to this problem? At this point, I don't think the designers at 5e are interested in addressing this problem in the future. Wisdom is so deeply integrated into the class and skill systems that there would be no clean way to adjust or remove it. The creators of Pathfinder 2e at least had the guts to split it into wisdom and perception, which I think was a sound decoupling. So if I were still playing 5e or a similarly modern edition of Dungeons and Dragons, I just wouldn't even try to touch wisdom. However, because I run older versions of D&D, I have a lot more latitude to adjust or remove wisdom. Wisdom has a minor effect on resisting spells and is tied into classes like the cleric, but neither of those are too inhibitory. Clerics, for example, could be attached to charisma instead of wisdom, which would put an interesting if somewhat cynical spin on religion in your game. So, what are some examples of ways OSR creators have adjusted wisdom? Ben Milton of the YouTube channel Questing Beast put an interesting spin on wisdom in his classless game Knave, where he made wisdom cover ranged accuracy and other ranger-like activities. While part of me cringes at that flagrant expansion of wisdom well beyond its actual meaning, I do think that's a clever way to make wisdom a meaningful ability score for everyone. Seven Voyages of Zylarthan, an OD&D retro clone, removed clerics and made it so wisdom allowed every character to attempt to turn undead with varying degrees of success. While I do find that to be somewhat strange, I appreciate the attempt to tie wisdom's inherent spiritual element to an actual mechanic that isn't just a class. Other OSR games like Into the Odd have just outright removed wisdom, which makes a lot of sense to me. If I were to remove wisdom, I would probably replace it with an ability score like perception or willpower. I think perception would be an excellent addition to D&D as an ability score, as people are constantly interacting with the world through their five senses, whether they're looking for traps, listening for sneaking foes, or smelling poison gas ahead of them. Willpower, on the other hand, would be almost entirely reactive and defensive like Constitution, and would primarily give magical and mental defense. Despite all my rational objections to wisdom as an ability score, I will admit that I do aesthetically appreciate it. I think it really says something about the world that wizards harness magic with intelligence while druids harness magic with wisdom. I like the inherent conflict between wisdom and intelligence, faith versus reason, nature versus civilization. However, I don't think wisdom accomplishes enough as an ability score to justify its inclusion, despite that great thematic conflict. So, my ultimate conclusion is that wisdom needs to go. I do think that's the trend. More and more OSR games seem to be shucking wisdom as an ability score. Plus, I'm not sure how many games that aren't D&D or aren't even trying to be D&D have ever used wisdom as an ability score, other than crappy 5e knockoffs like a bad Pokemon game I once looked at, which, when I say it was crappy, I mean it. It gave Ash Ketchum a strength score, like he's ever going to punch a Charizard. But anyway, those are just my thoughts. Let me know if you agree or disagree. Whichever way you swing, I'd love to hear what you have to say. Otherwise, thank you for watching. Have a good one, and be wise.